Here I'm going to solve this equation by completing the square. So the first step is to rearrange the terms so the constant is on its own on the right side. So I'm going to move that minus 8 by adding 8 on both sides. And then at this point, I'm just going to make the space a little bit bigger so I have room to make my calculation here to complete the square. I'm going to be adding a number in this space. To identify what number to add there, what you need to do is take that coefficient in front of the x, that -2, and you divide that number by 2 and you square it. So when I do that, I end up with -2 divided by 2 is -1, squared is 1. So on the left side, notice that I added a 1. Now remember, with equations, you can't just add any number on a side. If you add a number on one side of the equation, that's okay, as long as you add the same number on the other side of the equation. So I have to do a +1 over here as well. And so let's see what we have left. At this point, we're ready to factor. So if you look at the left side, we start off with just an x squared. There's 3 terms. So we need 2 sets of parentheses, and x is what is first in each set of parentheses. To identify what number goes in here, what you do is you look at the last number, this +1, and we're looking for 2 numbers that multiply to give us the last number and add to give us that middle coefficient. So if you go through the different options, you see it's -1 and -1. So I'm going to put -1, -1. Now x minus 1 times x minus 1 is the same as x minus 1 squared. And now we've done it. We've completed the square. Now it is something squared, and we can solve by taking the square root. Before we do that, though, I want to show you a quick shortcut. Instead of factoring like I did here, the number inside of the parentheses, this -1, is always going to be what you get when you took that middle number and divided by 2. So -2 divided by 2 is -1. And that's what's inside the parentheses. Now I can solve by taking the square root. So this now is something squared. To undo that square, you take the square root and that cancels it out. So I just have x minus 1. And the square root of 9, your calculator will tell you it's 3, but it's actually a +3 or a -3. Because 3 times 3 is 9, but also -3 times -3 is 9. And you're not done yet because you want to solve for x, so we need to move that -1 by adding 1 to both sides. So if you look on the right side, you have +3 or -3 plus 1. So if you think of that, you have +3 plus 1, which is 4, and you have -3 plus 1, which is -2. So those are our 2 answers. Now I'm going to show you 2 more examples where the answers get a little bit more messy in step 5 where we're solving by taking the square root. The rest of the problem is almost identical. The only thing I'm doing is changing this number here so that it doesn't come out as cleanly in these steps. So let's look at this first example. So again, the first few steps are exactly the same, so I'm just going to pause it and write those steps here. So if you need to pause the recording for a moment and look at what I've done for these steps, again, it's the same as the first example. Let me know if you have any questions. But for step number 6, all we're doing then is to undo that square, we take the square root. But this time, the square root of 7, when I put that in my calculator, it gives me a decimal. So you always look at it to see if you can simplify. Maybe you could take the square root of part of it. But for 7, the only 2 numbers that multiply to give us 7 are 1 and 7. So there's nothing I can pull out from under that square root symbol. So I'm just going to leave that as plus or minus 7, square root of 7. And then to move that -1, I'm going to add 1 to both sides. So the way you write your answer in this case is 1 plus or minus square root of 7. So let's go over one more example and change that constant term again. This time it's 17. Again, I'm just going to pause it and write down the first 4 steps. So let's look at what we get when we solve this one by taking the square root. When we take the square root, that cancels out the square. And the square root of 18 again gives you a decimal. But if you think of 18 and you break it down to see if maybe you can factor or you can take the square root of part of it, you see that it's the same as 2 times 9, and the 9 is 3 times 3. So 18 is 2 times 3 times 3. So if you think of this, remember your plus or minus 2 times 3 times 3. What the square root symbol is asking is what's being squared. And so if you look underneath the square root, you see that what's being squared is 3. 3 times 3 is 3 squared. So we can pull that 3 out in front of the square root symbol. So we have x minus 1 equals plus or minus 3 square root of 2. Now the last step is to move that minus 1 by adding 1 to both sides. And when you do, you get 1 plus or minus 3 square root of 2.